cheers for coming. I realised that there's a whole bunch of talks, activities, other things you could be doing, people you could be chatting to. So I really appreciate you kind of turning up to see my talk. It's Dungeons and Datacentres, which is kind of covering some of my thoughts and dilemmas that I've had with sort of experience in social engineering recently. So who am I? My name's Tom. I've done way too long, 15 years in InfoSec. So I consider myself a kind of long-term listener, first-time caller. As far as this sort of stuff's concerned, it's my first talk, hence why I'm kind of bracketed as being a rookie. The ridiculously long combination of letters there means that I'm a senior subject matter expert for advanced intrusion testing at Lloyds Banking Group, which is the repeated three-letter acronym way of saying that I kind of manage, scope, and design and perform RedTeam testing for Lloyds Banking Group. I'm a avid gamer of pretty much any type, so from computer games through to board games through to card games. If you gave me a tennis ball and said throw this at a wall and you'll score some points, I'd probably sit there for a few hours. A massive psychology, language, and systems nerd. So any of that stuff I absolutely love. It takes a bunch of time. I'll read anything about it, kind of dig deeper and kind of look at that sort of stuff. And then also I'm a kind of social engineering junkie. So it's one of my specialisms that I fall under the subject matter expert bit of my job title. I kind of started digging into it probably 6 or 7 years ago. And then since I've been doing red teaming in the last sort of 3 or 4, it's become kind of a lot more focused and a sort of decent part of what I do day to day. So what I'm going to do is kind of go down the rabbit hole, go through red teaming, what it is a little bit, social engineering, how that fits in, and then we're going to go into the bits of social engineering that I want to talk about, the bits that I think are interesting, and there's some stuff that we can kind of learn about how to deal with people and how to, appropriately social engineer them, that sort of thing. So out of interest, who works in red team, offensive security, or that type of thing, or for a company that has got that? Cool. So for you guys, I hope I don't teach you too much how to suck eggs for the start of it, and that in the last part of it, you'll get some sort of useful information out of it. That quote there is in theory, what a red team is. It's a independent group that challenges an organization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sounds really cool. Is really appealing and probably one of the more interesting bits of InfoSec, in my opinion. In actual fact, it isn't hacking. It's really, really heavily bureaucratic and regulated hacking with like 80% reporting, and that isn't any different when you work for a bank. It's probably, if anything, a little bit worse. So scoping red team engagements and that sort of thing, and what you include and what you don't, is a real art. Particularly when you're dealing with sort of a large organization, they don't want you to go, everything's in scope, even though the ideal for a red team, if you're going to prove anything, is that, yes, everything's in scope. So there's a whole bunch of those arguments that go on in my day-to-day life, but hopefully going to talk about some of the more interesting bits. So social engineering within red teaming. So red teaming is meant to be a holistic way of testing. You're meant to test kind of everything in the entire environment. A load of people break stuff down into being PPT. I use kind of PPPT. I always have to check that I've said the right amount of P's. So covering people, process, physical, and technology whenever we do tests. So when people talk about social engineering, they tend to go, this is the bit we're interested in, This is the bit where people talk about the humans being an organization's biggest weakness, or there's no patch for human stupidity, and all that sort of really, really bad phrases that don't encourage good behaviors in your user base. In actual fact, I tend to find that the really interesting bits tend to come when we look at the kind of intersection between people, process, and technology, and physical, and how like the people monitor those controls, how they use them, that sort of thing. So you find a lot of vulnerabilities in the way that the people interact with them. And in the case of kind of the blue team, which is the only kind of blue thing I'll probably discuss for this talk, like the defenses you can put in place, there are still some. And if you look at defenses in terms of technology or process controls or physical controls to stop people doing the wrong thing, then that does actually prevent quite a few social engineering attacks. So if I'm breaking down social engineering, I break it down into kind of 4 main sections. So OSINT/recon, which is a massive subject in its own, and is the foundation of pretty much any social engineering you do. If you want to do good social engineering, you need good OSINT and recon. Fortunately, I haven't got as long in this talk as I'd like to kind of dig really deep into how to do OSINT, recon, that sort of thing. But, it's an essential thing, and you can find a whole ton of stuff out there online on it. So then we've got phishing, which is, the most well-known, really high-volume stuff. And, I think the figure is 65% of breaches start with a phishing email, that sort of thing. Then we've got vishing, which is phone social engineering and doing it over the phone. And then the bit that I'm always gutted that there isn't a word that starts with ishing or ends in ishing is impersonation, which is the in-person physical part of SE where you go in, talk to people, and actually get them to do what you want in person. So I'm going to cover these two areas mainly because phishing is kind of a thing all of its own, and vishing, impersonation cover a lot of the same type of skills, a lot of the, dealing with people, dealing with individuals, conversation, rapport, that sort of stuff. So if we break down vishing and impersonation, so it starts off with the OSINT recon phase right at the start. As I said, it's a whole world of interest and details. Then we go on to kind of pretext development. So this is where you're developing the person that you're going to be when you are socially engineering someone, when you're going in, when you're calling them. This is how you define what it is that you're going to do. Then you go for what is the bump or initial approach. With vishing, this is really, really simple. So this is the bit where, they pick up the phone. When you're doing impersonation, a bit more complicated. It's the bit where you stop being a stranger to them. So you answer a bunch of questions as you approach them in order to kind of put them at ease, stop them questioning you too much. Then we go on to building trust and rapport, which is what normal people would call a conversation. But when you're doing social engineering, there's a whole raft of other factors that you're trying to do at the same time as having that conversation. And then achieving your objective. So trying to get someone to do something they may or may not want to do in order to help your attack or progress what it is you're doing. So as we go kind of further down the rabbit hole, these are the bits that I'm probably going to focus on. That bump sort of approach stuff is kind of fairly low-key and not something that I'm going to go into detail on, but the kind of the pretext development, how you work out what you're going to be, how you're going to approach it, and the building trust and rapport section, the bit that's kind of the main meat of your social engineering engagement. Cool. So I'm going to go over some of the stuff that I use as kind of weapons at my disposal. So as I said, I've done a bunch of social engineering research, but a bunch of reading about it, as well as a couple of different training courses, that sort of thing. I'm a social engineering pen test professional and master's level social engineering expert from socialengineer.org. But on top of that, there's some extra elements that I've sort of used in order to help me with these dilemmas and problems. So psychology and sociology. Huge subject, whereas social engineering as an idea has been around for like 10, 15 years. Obviously, psychology and sociology have been around for hundreds. So there's a whole bunch of tools, a whole bunch of stuff that lets you dissect how people work, what they think, that sort of thing. And it is where a ton of my research time goes, is into digging into this. So another thing, which is kind of quite awkward for most techies and that sort of thing, improv acting. So the really, really similar part of social engineering that applies to this is kind of the impersonation section. When you're there, when you're talking to someone, you kind of want to be able to come up with ideas, discuss new things, and kind of edit how you're behaving and what you're talking about in order to apply better to the target. It's also the bit that, at least I find, is the big fear of social engineering, is that part of going, oh my God, I'm going to be stood there and I'm going to choke. I'm not going to know what to say. I'm going to panic. Actually, the improv acting stuff really helps with that because you're put on the spot like 20 times and every time you do it. And then kind of the big nerd influence and what influenced the title of the talk. I think it puts me second on the nerd hierarchy, on the geek hierarchy, slightly below furries. I've been doing kind of D&D tabletop stuff for like 15 years. I've been a LARPer for like well over half my life. In the last few years, I've run 7 or 8 different events for people where we've built entire immersive worlds. We've kind of, developed characters for them, things to interact with, done like 20 different pretext generations, which we define as, roles for them to interact with, that sort of thing. And it's a really, really good opportunity to study human behavior, human interaction in kind of weird settings. So like, very, very difficult in real life to watch someone who's scared for their life, but I get to do it like 20 times every event, which is great, and going, if I give a person X, Y, Z information, what will they then do with it? Which is something you just can't do without, well, occasionally in social engineering you get to do that, but as I've kind of done it, I've seen the parallels between the two quite a lot. So, dilemmas and thoughts, which is kind of the main focal point of this talk, which is kind of issues or problems I've experienced whilst doing social engineering and the tools or ideas that I've used in order to help kind of fix them. So, the pretext development part. As I said, relies really heavily on OSINT and recon. That little diagram is one bit that's really important to assess what you can and can't do. So, like, I would fail miserably to impersonate an Olympic athlete, a pregnant woman, or a brain surgeon, and you kind of have to accept that. But that being said, in some situations, you can go, I'm going to impersonate a brain surgeon because I need to do it for 5 minutes to this one guy before I leave him away and never get asked questions about it again. So it is kind of possible to learn some things very, very quickly. I crammed at one point to be an interior designer in the space of 2.5 hours and managed to carry it off relatively successfully for like an hour and a half in a discussion with people. Kind of, you have to understand what it is your pretext needs, so what you're trying to accomplish with this social engineering engagement, and then look at who you are and what you think you can be within the time frames you've got. So, sorry, just tracking back on that. So a couple of dilemmas that I faced when doing this is what preparation should I do? Because that's a really kind of hard thing to decide. There's a whole world of preparation you could be doing, and you don't know what's useful, what's not. And then there's the thing about how perfect is too perfect for your pretext. You know, if you're approaching someone, exactly how detailed do you want to make it, and what do you want to talk about? So, one of the things I call spontaneity versus preparedness dilemma. So you've got a temptation to write a full autobiography. You know, you're going in, you're pretending to be a certain person, and you want to write all the details. You want to prepare everything. If you're like me, you'll want to kind of design everything, put it all down, make sure you've got it all embedded in your mind, that sort of stuff. But if you lock yourself down too hard, you lose the ability to kind of improvise when you need to, when you're talking to someone. So if you approach someone and their, kid does football, then you want to be able to switch your pretext to going, yeah, my kid also does football. You establish yourself as part of a tribe with them, you build a link with them, you start building trust and rapport, and you can then leverage that further on to get what you want. So being prepared is great, as much as you can remember it all. Like, that's one of the things I tend to find as well, is that you get to a point where you've gone, I'm not going to remember all the details of this, I'll just remember certain key things, and then kind of be spontaneous with the rest. But even like spontaneity requires a basic amount of background knowledge for you to leverage in order to know what to do with it. So I use this, which is Whitney Maxwell's kind of breakdown of digital footprints. I'll turn it on his head and go, okay, like different categories of stuff. So core, intermediate, peripheral information. So things like personal preferences, likes and hobbies. Really good thing to be spontaneous with, really good thing to connect with people on and talk about a little bit. You need to do a little bit of research on anything that you're going to be spontaneous about, that you're going to bring up, so you can at least cover it. The kind of, I've heard it termed as being the Renaissance man, so knowing a little bit about everything, so you can use that to better leverage your pretext. When you're talking about the kind of intermediate stuff, so categories like your hometown, employer, religion, you want to make sure that's consistent research. You know enough facts that you can come across as someone who works for company X or who lives in town X. You don't want to be them going, oh, whereabouts in Leeds do you live? And you going, oh, by the car park, is, absolutely dreadful. So you want to make sure you know enough details that you can say that if you are questioned in normal conversation about it, you can still come up with the right ideas. And then kind of peripheral stuff, which is the individual facts about you. That stuff, you need to know it because everyone knows their individual facts about them, but it doesn't need to necessarily be researched or linked into anything or anything like that. So long as you're consistent with it and you're not giving, you're not introducing yourself as Bob to person one and then Carl to person two, you should most of the time be fine. So the other aspect, the too good to be true dilemma. So this is something I've seen a couple of times whilst doing social engineering. People are naturally suspicious of anything that's too perfect. So you do your OSINT, you find out everything about this person that you're going to be targeting, and you're like, right, I'm going to write the perfect pretext. He's into photography, his kids do football, his wife's a chef. So you show up with, your cooking book under one hand, your camera under the other one, and start talking about how great your kid's football was. And he's going to look at you and go, that feels wrong because that's too close to me. And normally there's more differentiation between you and strangers you meet. Unless this is going to be, unless your pretext is that guy's going to meet his soulmate, you probably don't want to be going to that level of detail. So what I find is that there's a kind of a role-play game technique that's really useful here. So sit down and go, right, that list of what I am or what I could be and what the pretext needs, build it out, list it out in a big page, and then go, I'm going to choose one of those at random rather than necessarily I'm going to go, straight for this first one that I've made that's absolutely perfect. So take all the elements, split them out, and then use a kind of random generator to go, yeah, I'll be this, because then it's not going to be precisely spot on and perfect. Cool. So this is something that comes from 1730 when they started defining the properties of actors in plays and that sort of thing. But it's something that I find really useful. So my brain naturally works and approaches stuff, and I'll go, here's the details, here's the facts, that sort of stuff. This sort of thing is the thing that I never really think about unless I'm kind of forced to. So I won't go through them all, but a few of them, like, you know, the dramatic need of what you're trying to accomplish, kind of the attitude of the character that you're trying to portray, the pretext that you developed, that sort of stuff. And then, like, weaknesses and mannerisms are good ways to kind of differentiate yourself, break away from being the same thing every time you do it, and kind of also help you load better into what I consider to be a kind of different brain VM, in that you are then that thing and you are that person. So, that's covering pretext generation. So I'm going to go on to kind of developing trust and rapport. So this is the foundation of every social engineering attack. Really, really heavily leverages body language and that sort of thing. I'm not going to go into detail on that because there's a load of people who've covered it. Books by, Ian Mann, Paul Ekman, Joe Navarro, as well as talks by Chris Hadnagy, Sharka, Ian Mann, a whole bunch of other people. So sociology kind of defines a breakdown of conversations into form and content, so you can kind of analyze them independently of each other. And an aspect of the form of conversations is a thing called flow, which was defined in a 2014 research paper by Kudenberg, Postmes, and Al. So it's defined as being the way a conversation is experienced as being smooth, efficient, and mutually engaging. And as a social engineer, I read that description and went, holy crap, I want that in every single social engineering conversation I have. If you've got those three elements, then that conversation is going to be going well. You're going to find it really easy to develop trust and rapport, and that person's going to be a lot more compliant when it comes to it. So talking about the form part of it, there's the classic social engineering advice. You know, you match the tone, pitch, speed, and volume of the person you're talking to. You've got to bear in mind that when you've developed that pretext before, you've developed this character that you're going to be whilst you're doing your social engineering, that if you try and do this stuff too hard, it can sometimes break that. So that's a conscious decision you need to make as to whether to, you know, if you want to be someone who's nervous or apprehensive or, excited, then you might be talking a lot quicker than normal. You might be kind of like putting more and pauses into your conversation. So you don't necessarily want to match all those if you still want to come across as the same kind of aspects. One of the things, never try and do accents. Like, unless you've got an accent that you know 100% you can pass for that person, if you're put into that city, then don't even try and do it. Learn from Sean Connery. Stick to whatever your traditional accent is. And the other thing that I found that isn't included in that SE advice, I don't know whether it's because it's a UK thing, because we shift around kind of accents and formality in different places so much, but varying your formality, so abbreviating words, not using words that are too long, or doing the opposite and being really formal with something can really help to kind of put across your needs, what you're trying to do, what you're trying to accomplish, that sort of thing. So one of the other things that I found is that a lot of the traditional social engineering advice is you dealing with an individual, you approaching that one person and getting them to do what you want. And it's really, really rare that, it's pretty often that you'll find that that person's in a group of people, and that's a very, very different situation to approach. So what I'll try and do a lot of the time is when you first enter a group conversation, look at positions of body blading and feet. So like where your hips, shoulders, head are pointing and where your feet are pointing. That can help show kind of how the authority and flow of that conversation goes, who's important, who likes who, that sort of thing. And then you can kind of match that to some extent to make sure you fit in. Now, another one of the things that kind of traditional social engineering advice comes along with is being kind of synchronous, being similar to the people, talking about same things, agreeing on every subject, that sort of thing, and matching them in a whole bunch of ways. Actually, sometimes you'll find, especially in group conversations, that you want to be what they call alternating or complementary. So this means that you have a value to add to the conversation. You're not being the same as what they're saying. You're adding something new, but you need to make sure it's not a conflicting thing. So add something new that kind of couples on to what they've been saying. And then listening out for common grounding noises. So this was defined by someone called Kashima, or a researcher called Kashima, which is the noises we make during a conversation when we're not the one talking that confirm that we're still part of that conversation. So the yeps, aha, that sort of thing. Listen for those and see what the ones that are used in that social context, and try and mimic those when you're agreeing to stuff. It's really good. Like psychology-wise, it establishes you as being part of their tribe, even though that tribe is just people in this conversation. It establishes you as being part of that and instantly kind of connects you to people. So onto flow. As I said, it's a really ephemeral concept measuring how well a conversation is going. It's kind of key on the prompts for transfer of focus to be able to kind of assess how well it's going. So if you listen to two people who've got really good flow, there'll be hardly any gap between one of them finishing and the other one starting. And people won't talk over each other. They won't interrupt as much. Like, it'll naturally kind of bounce between people and they'll pass the different amounts of focus. So that focus transfer is normally less than 200 milliseconds in a good conversation. So if you're thinking for more than a fifth of a second about what you're going to say, then it can make it seem like you're not really part of the conversation and like the conversation's going awkwardly. Flow comes really easy for people who talk a lot. So these days especially, you'll text, you'll email, you'll Slack or whatever. I've started trying to force myself to actually call people on the phone and talk to them, because like exercising those muscles is super important. And if you're not doing that, then you kind of start falling out of the way to make good conversation. So there's a really good improv counting game for when you're doing social engineering with a group of you or a pair of you. You want to make sure the flow between you is kind of really strong and that you're not going to, talk over each other, you're not going to interrupt, which is a really simple game involving counting. So the concept being that between you need to count to 20. You're not going to just take it in turns. You're going to say whichever number you feel like saying. And then after about 4 or 5 times of doing it and talking over each other, where you both say 2 at the same time or you both say 4, eventually you get to the stage where you're naturally picking up on that person's kind of body language and cues that they're about to speak, and you'll stop talking over them so much. And being able to develop that with whoever you're social engineering with means that when you end up with your target, you're not likely to kind of enter in that same situation, and they'll find it a lot easier to enter into the flow of your conversation. And then the other one, which is really, really good for active listening. So if you're talking to people, then a lot of the time you'll be sat there thinking about what you're going to say next rather than what they're actually saying. So there's an improv game which involves starting your sentence with the last letter of the last person's sentence. That's really, really good and is really good for forcing you to listen right to the very end of a sentence before you start the next one. If you can do that with that same lack of sort of too much of a gap, then you become a really good active listener. People really start to kind of engage with you and talk to you about stuff. And that's really good. You can do it deliberately. If you go to someone and go, hey, let's, do that game whilst we're talking, you can have a regular conversation whilst applying that. And likewise, you can apply it to people who aren't really paying attention. So even if they don't know that you're playing that improv game, you can do it and kind of just force yourself to wait till the end of a sentence before you think about what you're going to say. So, content. So content is what you're actually going to say to your target. It's the things you're going to deliver, the things you're going to discuss. So you always want to let them lead and kind of use the work that you put into your pretext earlier to help kind of shape and direct the conversation and make sure you've got stuff to add. You want to try and bring people into helping you. So people don't want to back out after they've committed to doing something. People will find that if they've started doing something for you, they'll carry on doing that something for you, or they'll carry on doing something else for you. Really kind of get those stuff in early to know what you're kind of framing to get them because for what you want to do later. So having another person to shift and blame to for any kind of effort or rule breaking they need is really, really useful. So going, oh God, my boss is asking me to do this, or, oh, my wife wants me to do this because she'll be really upset if I don't. People can empathize with having a, potentially grumpy partner or a pain in the ass boss. So they'll instantly kind of puts you into one of their tribes as well. And then also if there's sort of negative feeling or they don't want to do what it is you're asking, then they're not directing that at you. They're directing that at some guy who's off in the background who they never meet. And then they be aware of the need to pivot. So pivoting is one of the things that gets discussed quite often. So it's a situation where the target is either intentionally or not is challenging your pretext or kind of the frame of your attack. So situations where it feels like they're putting you into a situation where either they're correct or you're correct. So if you come in and go, hi, I'm Dave from IT, and they go, well, I know everyone from IT, then this is the point where you need to kind of pivot and go, oh, actually, I'm a contractor, or I only started last week, or basically find a third option in order to be able to give them something that makes them feel like they're still correct, you haven't lied to them, and they can carry on about their business. So, role-play games, kind of discuss this as being an option 3. Traditional difference between kind of tabletop role-play games and that sort of thing versus computer games is that they'll always be kind of an option 3 because you're in the real world and you've got everything to work with that's under the sun. So there's a really good improv cornerstone for this, which is the yes and game. So someone makes something up, the next person goes, yes, and so you basically confirm what the person said and then add something to it. Now, when you're doing social engineering and you end up in a situation where you need to pivot, that's because they've said no but to you, which is a really, really hard thing and tends to break down improvisation. So there's a few role-playing games and sort of tabletop games that are really, really good for practicing this. So there's one called The Adventures of Baron von Munchausen, which is one set of being a like late 1800s kind of adventuring baron, where you go, this is the crazy story I made up, and then someone challenges you, and you need to come up with some idea going, yes, you're right, but this is why that's right, and I'm still right. So kind of learning those things to do in order to be able to kind of still confirm that they are correct and that the challenge is valid, but answer it and move on. So this is something, again, super easy to practice with friends. You know, I play a game called, well, termed Bullshit with a friend of mine, and I'll say something that is nonsense or is, you know, a lie that's made up. They'll call bullshit and go, that's bullshit because of this. And then your immediate response to that needs to be, yeah, but this is actually why it's still true. And you kind of have a vague argument where you're not actually arguing. Really easy to practice with friends, a really good thing to kind of develop and kind of work from there. So that's kind of getting towards the conclusion of my talk. I think I covered the sort of key stuff that I wanted to. Thanks for coming and listening. Some of the takeaways, whilst social engineering engagements, even working in part of a red team and it being actually part of my job is something that doesn't happen all the time. Actually finding ways to practice is really easy. So games like that type of thing, like one of my things recently has been trying to start a conversation with 3 strangers every day, which is really, really difficult, especially if you're in London on the tube. You get looked at like an absolute crazy person, but trying to find ways to, you know, use words at the very least. And then a bit of conscious effort and kind of research and a bit of planning can change your int bonus to a charisma bonus. So people who are aware of D&D and stuff will understand. So going from taking your intelligence and kind of that analytical mindset and that sort of thing and using it towards conversations and discussions can mean that you actually come across as being really charismatic when actually you're just substituting it for a whole bunch of stuff you've learned and practiced. And then, whilst the humans are the last line of defense and all that sort of thing, they can actually be sometimes helped by process and technology controls, and physical controls to stop them doing things that they really, really shouldn't be. So if people want to contact me and talk to me about any of this stuff afterwards, all my contact stuff's down there, Twitter, Gmail. I hang around on the Many Hats Club, Discord and in the SEO Synth and RedTeam channels. So always happy to chat there. Yeah, cool. Any questions? Yes. So I struggle to give direct examples as part of the fact. So I work for a large bank, and they've gone. I can't talk about any actual details of stuff like that. But so when social engineering stuff goes wrong, especially if it's kind of a really key pivotal moment, tend to find that it can massively skew things. It raises suspicions in people, that sort of thing. So a lot of the time, it's one of those things where if it starts to go wrong, you can't really remediate and fix it unless you can pivot well and kind of transfer it off at the time. Then you end up in a situation where you're going, right, we just have to avoid that person, that subject, that pretext that you developed, because you don't want to kind of carry on pushing something if people start to get suspicions. It's a real slippery slope. So. Yeah, so there is some degree of kind of going, here's my get out of jail free card, I'm going to walk away. Ideally, just leaving and going, we're just going to leave that and let it be someone who was vaguely suspicious and hasn't reported it and hopefully doesn't. So we tend to try and feed it back. So we don't do it to individuals is one of the kind of cardinal rules, because for social engineering, anyone can trip up, anyone can make those mistakes, and you don't want any organization kind of persecuting the individual for having made the mistake that anyone can make. But yeah, we do kind of go, this is the type of thing you need to be looking at. But a lot of the time, it's just talking about like awareness of the fact that this is a type of attack, and then kind of encouraging critical thinking. So people actually go, is this really what's going on, rather than just naturally assuming, yes, it is. Cool. Well, I'm going to be lurking around here and probably outside smoking for the rest, well, for the next half hour, and then I'm about for the rest of the day. So feel free to catch up then. Cheers. Thank you very much.